The locket didn't snap shut anymore because the silver was warped from the heat of a house fire that had claimed everything but Silas Thorne's regrets. He sat on a ridge overlooking the valley of Bitter Creek, the metal cool against his calloused palm, watching the way the wind combed through the parched yellow grass like a hand through unkempt hair. He had spent 10 years trying to outrun the smell of that smoke, riding until his horse lathered and his own heart went numb. But the West was a circle, not a line. No matter how many borders he crossed or how many names he shed, the dust always eventually settled on the same truth. He had left her standing in the cinders of a life he wasn't brave enough to build. Now the air tasted of impending rain, a heavy metallic promise that felt less like a blessing and more like a reckoning. Below him, the McCready Ranch sat huddled against the base of the foothills, a collection of weathered timber and stubborn endurance. It was a place of straight lines and mended fences, a stark contrast to the jagged, lawless life Silas had led since the night the sky turned orange. He tucked the broken locket into his vest, the ghost of a girl's laughter echoing in the canyons of his mind, and nudged his mare down the slope. He wasn't coming back to reclaim a throne or a woman. He was coming back because he had heard a man's name whispered in a saloon 300 miles south, a name associated with land grabbing and a cold, calculated cruelty that was currently circling the only person Silas had ever truly loved. He was a wolf returning to a fold he had once abandoned, not to play the shepherd, but to kill the other wolves. The jingle of his spurs was the only sound as he rode into the yard. The ranch felt quiet, the kind of heavy silence that precedes a funeral or a storm. A woman stepped out onto the porch, a Henry rifle resting in the crook of her arm with a familiarity that made Silas's chest ache. She didn't look like the girl who had braided wildflowers into her hair by the creek. Her face was a map of North American winters, her eyes the color of wood smoke and flint. She didn't aim the rifle, but she didn't lower it either. She stood there, framed by the peeling white paint of the doorframe, watching him with an intensity that felt like a physical weight pressing against his ribs. "The road to hell is paved with men who think they can come back whenever the wind changes, Silas," Cassianna said. Her voice was lower than she remembered, a melodic rasp that sounded like silk being dragged over gravel. "I didn't come for the road, Cass," Silas replied, his voice sounding like a stranger's in his own ears, dry, hollow, and stripped of hope. He pulled his hat low, shielding his eyes from the glare of the dying sun. "I heard about Miller. I heard he's got his sights on your water rights." "And I suppose you think a man with blood on his hands is the right cure for a man with grease on his," she countered, finally stepping down onto the dirt. She walked with a limp he hadn't known about, a slight hitch in her gait that felt like a knife to his pride. She stopped 10 feet away, the distance between them a canyon filled with 10 years of unsaid words. "You're 10 years too late to protect this land, and you're a lifetime too late to protect me." "I'm not here to protect you," Silas lied, his grip tightening on the reins until the leather groaned. "I'm here because I'm tired of running, and this is the only place left where the ground feels solid." She looked at him then, really looked at him, scanning the new scars on his jaw and the predatory way he sat his saddle. She saw the man he had become, the hired gun, the shadow, the drifter who had traded his soul for a faster draw. She said, "There's a room in the barn. You can earn your keep with a hammer and a shovel, but if you touch a gun on this property, you leave. I won't have that ghost in my house again." The first week was a study in controlled agony. Silas worked from the first light of gray dawn until his muscles turned to lead and his vision blurred. He mended the corrals that had been neglected, dug out the silt-choked spring, and replaced the rotted shingles on the porch. He did it all in a silence that was almost religious. Cassianna moved around him like a celestial body in a different orbit, constant, glowing, but untouchable. She brought him plates of salt pork and hardtack, leaving them on the porch railing without a word. They communicated through the work. A fixed gate was a plea for forgiveness. A refilled water crock was a temporary truce. One evening, as the heat of the day finally began to break, he found her sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the horizon where the thunderclouds were piling up like bruised wool. He sat on the bottom steps, careful to keep a respectful distance. The smell of her, soap, cedar, and something uniquely her, swirled around him, more intoxicating than any whiskey he'd ever drowned his sorrows in. "How did you get the limp, Cass?" he asked softly, the question he'd been choking on for days. She didn't look at him. She traced the line of her thigh with a calloused thumb. "The winter of '88. The cattle were drifting in the blizzard, and I went out to turn them. My horse went into a badger hole. I lay under that mare for 6 hours before I could crawl back. The frost took a bit of the feeling, and the brake didn't set right. I waited for you that night, Silas, not because I needed a man to pull me out from under a horse, but because I wanted someone to tell me it was worth getting up for. You were in Cheyenne, they told me, winning a poker hand." "I wasn't winning anything," Silas whispered, his head bowing. "I was losing everything, 1 mile at a time." "You didn't leave to save me from your past, Silas," she said, her voice trembling with a decade of suppressed rage. "You left because you were afraid to see me become as hard as you are. Well, look at me now. I'm made of iron and alkali. Are you happy?" He looked up, and for a fleeting second the mask of the stoic cowboy slipped. His eyes were raw, swimming with a grief so profound it made her breath hitch. "I've spent 3,000 nights wishing I was under that horse instead of you," he whispered, his head bowing. The honesty of it hung in the air, vibrating like a struck chord. He reached out, his hand hovering an inch from her boot, a silent request for a connection he didn't feel entitled to. He didn't touch her. He couldn't. He was a man who only knew how to break things, and she was already held together by wire and prayer. The external world, however, had no interest in their quiet tragedies. The following morning, 3 riders appeared on the rise, their silhouettes jagged against the pale morning sky. At the center was Miller, a man who dressed in fine broadcloth but wore a soul of cheap tin. He rode a black stallion that looked too expensive for the dust of Bitter Creek. He didn't dismount, he simply looked down at the ranch with the predatory gaze of a man counting his coins. "I see you found yourself some help, Miss McCready," Miller called out, his voice smooth and oily. He looked at Silas, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the type. The way Silas stood with his weight shifted, the way his eyes never stayed on one man for too long. "You're a long way from the saloons, friend. This is a private matter." "Everything is a private matter until the fences start moving," Silas said, stepping in front of the porch. He didn't have his guns, he had promised Cassianna, but he had a post-hole digger in his hand and enough repressed violence in his chest to level a town. "The deed says the water rights revert to the primary holder if the land isn't producing," Miller said, leaning over his saddle horn. "And I don't see much producing here but dust and bitterness. I'll be back on Friday with the sheriff and the papers. You can leave with your dignity or you can leave with nothing." As they rode away, the dust kicked up by their horses settled on Silas's boots like a shroud. He turned to see Cassianna standing in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame so hard her knuckles were white. The strength he had admired all week seemed to flicker. "You're going to take it, "Isn't he?" she asked, her voice small. "Everything my father built, everything I broke my body for." "Not while I'm drawing breath," Silas said. "You can't shoot a deed, Silas," she snapped, the fire returning to her eyes. "And you can't shoot the sheriff. If you kill them, you're just a murderer again, and I'm just a woman living on blood-soaked dirt. I won't have it." "Then what do you want me to be?" he cried, his frustration boiling over. "I'm not a lawyer, Cass. I'm a man who knows how to hold a line. Let me hold this one for you." "I want you to be the man who stayed," she screamed back, the sound echoing off the barn walls. She stormed toward him, poking a finger into his chest. "I don't need a hero. I need a partner. I need someone who looks at this dirt and sees a future, not just a battlefield." The rain finally came that night, but it wasn't the gentle soaking the land needed. It was a dry-line storm, a fierce, howling gale that ripped at the shutters and made the house groan. Silas sat in the barn, the smell of wet hay and horse sweat thick in his lungs. He had his gun belt laid out on a hay bale. The cold steel of the Colts felt familiar, like the hand of an old friend who only knew how to whisper bad advice. He could end Miller tonight. He could ride into town, find the man in the hotel, and put a bullet in his heart before the man could even reach for a lamp. It would be easy, it would be clean, and it would mean he'd have to leave again, forever. The barn door creaked open, and Cassianna stepped in, drenched to the bone. Her dress clung to her, and her hair was a dark mass of tangles. She looked at the guns, then at him. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows across the walls. "Is that the choice you're making?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the thunder. "It's the only way to make sure he doesn't hurt you," Silas said, his thumb tracing the hammer of the pistol. "No," she said, walking toward him until she was standing in the circle of light. She reached out and took his hand, not the gun hand, but the other one. Her skin was freezing, but her grip was like iron. "That's the easy way. The hard way is staying here and fighting him in the light. The hard way is admitting that you're worth more than the bullets in that belt." She stepped closer, into the heat of his body. Silas felt his resolution crumbling. The armor he'd worn for a decade, the layer of calloused indifference he'd used to protect himself from his own memories, was melting away. He looked at her, at the woman who had survived a blizzard and a broken heart, and he felt a terrifying surge of hope. "I don't know how to be that man, Cass," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Then learn," she said. She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a soft kiss, it was a collision of teeth and salt and 10 years of hunger. It was a desperate, grasping thing, a vow made in the middle of a storm. Silas dropped the gun. It hit the hay with a dull thud, forgotten. He pulled her against him, his hands tangling in her wet hair, his mouth seeking hers with a ferocity that made the world outside disappear. In the dark of the barn, with the rain hammering on the tin roof, Silas Thorne finally stopped being a ghost. Friday morning broke with a deceptive clarity. The air was scrubbed clean by the storm, and the valley was a vibrant, aching green. Silas and Cassianna stood on the porch together. He wasn't wearing his guns. He was wearing a clean shirt she'd mended for him and a look of grim determination. When Miller arrived, he wasn't just with 2 riders. He had the sheriff, a man named Galt who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Miller held a stack of papers, his face twisted into a triumphant grin. "Time's up, Miss McAdee," Miller said, dismounting. "The law is the law." "The law is a funny thing, Miller," Silas said, stepping forward. He held a small, leather-bound ledger in his hand. "I spent the last 2 days going through the McAdee family records, and I spent yesterday evening in town talking to the circuit judge who just arrived on the stage." Miller's grin flickered. "What are you talking about?" "The water rights aren't tied to the production of the land. They're tied to the original homestead grant from 1862, a grant that was signed by your father, Sheriff Galt. It states that as long as a direct descendant of the McAdee line occupies the house, the water rights are irrevocable." He stepped off the porch, leaning into Miller's space. "And since I'm a witness to the fact that Cassianna has never left this house for more than a day, your papers aren't worth the ink they're printed on." Miller turned to the sheriff, his face reddening. "Galt, do something. This drifter is interfering with a legal transaction." The sheriff looked at the ledger, then at Silas, then at Miller. He sighed, a sound of profound relief. "He's right, Miller. My father was meticulous about those grants. If Thorne found the original entry, there's nothing I can do. The land stays with the girl." Miller looked like he wanted to reach for his gun. His hand twitched toward his hip. Silas didn't move. He just watched him with those cold predator's eyes, a slight smile touching his lips. It was the look of a man who was almost hoping for an excuse. Miller saw it. He saw the wolf under the mended shirt. He backed down, his face a mask of impotent rage. "This isn't over," Miller hissed, climbing back onto his horse. "It is for you," Silas said, "because if you come back, I won't be holding a ledger. I'll be holding a memory of exactly how much I don't like you." As the riders disappeared over the ridge for the last time, Silas felt a weight lift off his shoulders that he hadn't even known he was carrying. He turned to Cassianna. She was leaning against the porch railing, her eyes wet with tears she refused to let fall. She looked at him, and for the first time in 10 years, the shadow was gone. "You stayed," she whispered. "I stayed," he said. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. The land was still hard, the winters were still cold, and Silas's past didn't just vanish because he wanted it to. There were nights when he'd see a rider on the horizon, and his hand would instinctively go to a hip that no longer carried a gun. There were days when Cassianna's leg ached so badly she couldn't leave the bed, and Silas would have to be both the strength and the tenderness for both of them. But they built something. They mended the house, and they mended each other. They found a way to talk about the fire without smelling the smoke. Silas learned to plant seeds instead of graves, and Cassianna learned to trust the sound of a horse in the yard. One evening, a year later, Silas found the warped silver locket in a drawer. He took it out to the porch where Cassianna was watching the sunset. He'd spent a week in town working for the blacksmith to pay for a jeweler to fix the hinge. He held it out to her, her fingers brushing his. She opened it to find a new daguerreotype inside, a picture of the two of them standing in front of the high willow, looking tired, dusty, and utterly, completely home. "It's better than perfect, Silas," she said, her voice a soft vow. "It's real." He pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on the top of her head. The wind over Bitter Creek blew, but it didn't mourn anymore. It just moved the grass, carrying the scent of rain and earth and a love that had been forged in the fire and tempered in the long, cold silence of the frontier. Silas Thorne was no longer a ghost, and he was no longer running. He was a man who had finally realized that the bravest thing he could ever do was simply stay. The sun dipped below the peaks, casting a long golden light over the valley. The shadows were still there, as there always are in the west, but they were just shadows. They didn't define the light, they only gave it depth. And as the stars began to poke through the velvet sky, Silas realized that the West wasn't a place you conquered, it was a place you allowed yourself to survive it if you were lucky enough to find someone to hold your hand in the dark. "I love you, Cass," he whispered into the twilight. "I know. You're still here. That's how I know." The legacy of the Thorne name would not be of gun smoke and fear, but of a ranch that held its ground and a love that outlasted the drought. They were the story of the frontier, not the glory, but the endurance. And in the quiet of the Bitter Creek Valley, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.